Montana Territory, July 1883. The sun had just broken through a line of clouds when the wagon was snapped in two with a sharp crack that echoed down the canyon. Brielle Thorne tasted dust as the wagon lurched sideways. She threw her arms around her infant son, shielding him as the wagon tipped. Her shoulder slammed into the wooden slats, and the world tilted wrong for a breathless second. Then it stopped. Broken axle. No hope of moving it. No one coming. She sat there for a few long moments, breathing hard, her baby nestled close against her chest. Liam whimpered in his sleep, oblivious. The road behind her was empty. The land ahead was nothing but open country and scrub. She had known the risk. Traveling alone with a baby and only a letter of introduction in her pocket wasn't wise. But after her husband died in that barn fire back in Kansas, and the landlord tossed her out, she had nowhere else to go. Her sister had promised a place near Helena, but that letter had no return address and no one in the last two towns had even heard of her. Brielle stood slowly, her knees shaky. She pressed a kiss to Liam's forehead and adjusted the sling that held him close. The wagon groaned as it settled into the dry earth. Nothing moved. No birds. No wind. Just the sound of her heart thudding hard behind her ribs. Then hoofbeats. She turned sharply, one hand gripping the edge of the wagon. A rider was coming down the trail, tall in the saddle, dust trailing behind him. He slowed when he saw the wreck, reined in a few paces away. He was lean and sun-browned, the kind of man who looked like he belonged out here. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, exposing forearms marked by honest work. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, and his eyes gray, sharp swept over her. The baby, the broken wagon. "You hurt?" he asked. Brielle shook her head, then found her voice. "No, just stuck." The cowboy nodded once. He dismounted, his boots crunching against the dry dirt. "Name's Merrick Dalton," he said. "You headed somewhere specific, ma'am?" "Helena," she said. "Or near it. My sister wrote. She said I could stay." Merrick glanced at the sun. "That wagon's not going anywhere, and you are not walking that road with a baby." "I do not have a choice," Brielle said, voice hoarse. Merrick looked at her for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. She stared at it. He did not say anything else, just kept his hand there, steady, like he meant it. Brielle looked down at Liam, then up again. Her hand shook as she reached out. Their fingers met. His hand was warm and rough and solid, and for the first time in days, she felt something other than fear. He led her to his horse and helped her into the saddle, careful not to jostle Liam. Then he tied her trunk to the pack mule he had behind him and mounted up behind her. His arms came around to steady her, not too close, just enough. They rode in silence for a while. The sun climbed, and the canyon opened into wide valleys freckled with sage. "How old's the boy?" Merrick asked finally. 5 months. She looked down at Liam's sleeping face. "He never met his father." Merrick did not say anything. His silence was not cruel. It just held the space around her like something steady. They made camp near a stream as dusk settled in. Merrick built the fire while she changed Liam and let him stretch beside the fire. She watched Merrick work, how he moved deliberately, how he checked the ground for snakes before setting down the bedrolls, how he gave her the cleanest blanket without saying a word. Later, after Liam drifted back to sleep, she sat across the fire from Merrick, knees drawn up, her hands around a tin cup of warm water. "You always ride this road?" she asked. "Twice a month," he said. "I check on fence lines for a ranch up north. Been doing it 3 years." "You live alone?" "Yeah." She nodded. "Me too. Since January." He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt something shift. Not pity, not judgment, just recognition. "You got family there in Helena?" he asked. Just my sister. If she is still there. If she is not? Brielle looked down at her son. Then I figure something else out. Merrick was quiet for a while. Then he said, I got a small place near Three Forks. Not much, but there is room. If it comes to that. She did not answer. But she remembered his hand earlier, how he had just held it out, like it was not a question. The next day they rode again. Merrick stopped at a trading post, bought her a fresh tin of milk powder, handed it to her without comment. She watched him, wondering what kind of man did that for someone he just met. They reached Helena by evening. Merrick helped her off the horse, handed her the trunk. She stood on the porch of the boarding house her sister had mentioned, Liam on her hip. But the woman at the door just shook her head. No Thorne here. Never was. Brielle did not cry. She just turned, holding Liam a little tighter. Merrick had not left. He stood beside his horse, watching her. Then, without a word, he held out his hand again. This time she did not hesitate. The rail depot at Helena faded behind them as Merrick led the pair south along the Gallatin Trail, his pack mule trailing behind in the late light. Brielle rode quietly, Liam nestled against her chest in the sling, his small hands curled beneath his chin. The boy had been fussing earlier, but the rhythm of the horse's gait had lulled him to sleep. Brielle didn't speak, not out of fear or stubbornness, but because there was simply nothing left in her to explain. She'd given all her words to loss and disappointment. What remained was the hush of endurance. They made camp that night beside a low bluff where cottonwoods leaned out over a stream. Merrick unsaddled the horses without a word, moving with the ease of someone long used to doing for himself. He gathered stones for a cook fire and lit it with a flint he kept in a pouch tied to his belt. Brielle watched from the edge of the blanket he'd laid out for her and Liam, not offering to help, and he didn't ask. After dark had settled in thick and wide, Merrick sat across from her with a tin plate of beans and cornbread. He didn't look at her directly, just handed her a plate and kept his eyes on the fire. You sleep much on the road? He asked. She shook her head. Not when it's just me and Liam. I have to keep watch. Coyotes, strangers. I sleep when he does if I can. Merrick nodded once. You won't need to stay up tonight. I'll keep watch. She studied his face, the way the firelight caught on the creases at his eyes, the faint line across his cheek that spoke of some old accident. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. You don't know me. I saw you were alone. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Wasn't going to ride past that. I didn't ask for help. You didn't have to. She looked down at Liam, his breath slow and even against her chest. I don't know what you're expecting from me, but I have nothing left to give. I'm not asking for anything, he said. You and the boy need a place. I've got one. She stared at the fire, listening to the way the wind moved through the grass. You always take in strangers? No, the word hung in the air, simple and final. She believed him. The next morning, the child woke early, hungry and restless. Brielle walked him down to the stream, careful to keep his bare feet dry as he kicked. Merrick didn't follow, but when she returned, he'd packed up camp and had a small tin cup of steeped chamomile waiting. They rode in silence most of the day, passing through groves of lodgepole pine and wide stretches of open pasture. Merrick pointed out where the Swan River forked off south, and where the land began to climb gentle and green toward the Madison Range. Your place near there? She asked. Other side of the rise. About a day and a half more. That night, they camped in a clearing where the grass grew high enough to muffle their footfalls. Merrick tied the horses close, strung up a line with tin scraps to rattle against predators, and showed Brielle how to bank the fire with dry moss to keep it smoldering through the night. After Liam had gone quiet, Brielle sat beside the coals, her hands wrapped around her knees. I kept hoping she'd be there, she said, voice low. My sister. I wrote her before I left Kansas. Told her when I'd arrive. Merrick didn't interrupt. She was never reliable. Always chasing some man or another. I should have known better than to think she'd wait for us. He stirred the fire with a stick, sending a soft glow up into the branches overhead. Some people stay put. Others don't. Doesn't mean you were wrong to hope. She looked at him then, and something in her chest eased. Not all at once, but like snow sliding off a roof in spring quiet, sure, and done with its waiting. When they reached his land the next evening, the sun was gold across the valley. A small cabin stood at the edge of a thicket, its roof shingled with bark and patched with care. A lean-to barn sat nearby, with a fenced pen and 2 goats nosing at the gate. Merrick dismounted first, then reached up for Liam, who had just woken from the ride. Brielle handed him over without thinking, and Merrick held the boy with surprising ease, resting him against his shoulder as he opened the cabin door. Inside, it smelled of sage and wood smoke. The hearth was swept, and a thick quilt covered the single bed in the corner. A rocker sat by the window, worn smooth at the arms. You can take the bed, Merrick said. I'll sleep out in the lean-to, or on the porch if weather holds. You don't have to do that. He looked at her, serious. I'm not putting you out, Brielle. She nodded once, then stepped inside, Liam still watching the stranger who had carried them farther than anyone else had dared. Later, as she rocked the boy to sleep by the window, she saw Merrick outside, splitting kindling with steady strokes. He didn't glance toward the cabin. He just worked, as if he had always known she would be there, and had been waiting for it all to finally begin. By the 3rd morning, the cabin had taken on a rhythm that Brielle hadn't known she was missing until she stepped into it. Liam stirred near dawn, and she rose to warm milk over the hearth, careful not to wake Merrick, who had taken to sleeping just outside the door on a bedroll laid beneath the porch awning. The floorboards creaked softly under her bare feet as she moved, and Liam blinked up at her with that quiet, searching look of his that always made her chest ache in a way she hadn't yet named. She'd just settled him back in the cradle Merrick had carried down from the loft the day before when the door opened. Merrick stepped inside with a coil of rope slung over one shoulder and a freshly skinned rabbit in hand. Snare by the bluff paid off, he said, setting it on the table. You cook. I can manage, she said, tying her hair back with a strip of cloth she'd kept in her trunk. I'm not fast, but I know my way around a skillet. He nodded and stepped aside, washing his hands in the basin by the door without another word. While she cleaned and dressed the rabbit, he fed the goats and checked the fencing beyond the eastern slope. She caught glimpses of him through the window, his shoulders moving with the surety of someone who understood the land and expected nothing from it but what he earned. That afternoon, while Liam napped, she took a rag and began wiping down the shelves, sweeping out the corners, sorting through the tins and jars Merrick had stored. Most were labeled in a tidy hand: flour, dried apples, chicory, but some held only guesses. She opened one and caught the scent of dried wild mint. It made her pause. Merrick returned just before dusk, his shirt damp with sweat and dust on his boots. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her stir the pot over the fire. You cleaned up, he said. I needed to do something with my hands, she replied. Idle makes me anxious. He took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair. There's always things to be done around here, if you want them. I'm not a guest, she said. I don't want to be treated like one. You're not, he said, and left it at that. They ate by lantern light, and afterward, he took Liam out under the stars to walk him while she washed the dishes. She stood in the doorway when she was done, arms folded against the cool night, watching Merrick pace slow across the yard, the boy tucked against his chest. Liam's small fingers clung to the edge of Merrick's collar, and Brielle felt something settle in her, soft and unfamiliar. "You're good with him," she said when Merrick returned. "Had a niece once," he said. "My sister's girl. Helped raise her after her husband drifted. She's married now, living out near Miles City." Brielle stepped aside so he could pass. "You close to your sister?" "Not anymore," he shrugged. "She left the territory last year. Don't write much." She didn't press. It was enough to know there'd been someone once. The next morning, Merrick brought down a rough-hewn cradle from the loft and set it beside the hearth. "Figured you might sleep better if he had a proper spot." She ran her hand along the smooth wood. "Did you make this?" He nodded. "Long winter, couple years back." She didn't say thank you. She just looked at him, and he looked back, and that was enough. By week's end, Brielle had taken over the cooking and had started tending the small garden plot behind the cabin. Merrick showed her how to check the soil for voles, how to set wire snares beneath the fence line to keep rabbits out. They didn't talk much, but when they did, it was always something new: how to identify chokecherry bark, when the clouds meant hail, which trees along the ridge held onto snow the longest. One evening, after Liam had gone to sleep and the wind had picked up outside, rattling the shutters, Brielle sat by the fire with a piece of mending in her lap. She looked up as Merrick entered with a stack of dry logs in his arms. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. He knelt by the hearth and added a log to the flames. "I did once. Figured I'd head south, maybe Texas. But the land keeps me here. Feels honest." She set the mending aside. "I used to think Kansas was home, but now I'm not sure it ever was." Merrick sat back on his heels, his face quiet. "You thinking about going?" "No," she said. "I'm just thinking." He nodded, eyes fixed on the fire. Then, after a moment, "You've changed the way the place feels." She looked at him, startled. "I didn't mean to. I didn't say it was bad." They sat in silence after that, the fire shifting low in the hearth. When she finally stood to check on Liam, Merrick rose too. "I'll see to the barn," he said. "Go on and rest." She hesitated. "You don't have to do everything." "I know," he said, his voice low. That night, wrapped in the quilt with Liam curled beside her, Brielle lay awake long after the wind had died. She stared at the ceiling beam above her head and listened to the faint sound of Merrick moving outside, the steady scrape of a shovel, the creak of the gate. She felt no fear, no doubt, just a weight in her chest that felt like something beginning. And when morning came, she found herself hoping he'd still be there, boots by the door, coffee already steeping, as if this life had always been waiting for her to step into it. A late summer storm rolled in 2 weeks after Brielle and Liam had settled into Merrick's cabin. The wind came first, pulling at the eaves and rattling the tin nailed over the window frames. Then the rain followed, steady and cold, soaking the fields until the soil turned slick beneath the goats' hooves. They stayed inside most of that day, the fire kept low and the shutters drawn. Brielle stood barefoot at the table, pressing down dough with the heel of her hand. She worked in silence, her hair braided back, sleeves rolled high. Liam babbled softly from his spot on a folded quilt near the hearth, reaching for the wooden spoon Merrick had carved for him the day before. Merrick sat by the window sharpening a draw knife, his movements slow, the rasp of steel on stone keeping time with the rain. His shirt was damp at the shoulders from the morning's chore of securing the barn doors, and a thin scratch ran along his forearm where a nail had caught him. "Do you miss being around more people?" Brielle asked without looking up. "Town, neighbors, church socials?" He paused, tested the edge of the blade with his thumb. "Not really. I never took to crowds. They expect things from you you don't always know how to give." She nodded, brushing flour from her hands. "Back home, I used to go to services mostly for the hymns. Not the talk, just the sound of everyone singing the same words at once. It felt like something solid." "I've never been much for hymns," he said. But I understand wanting to feel steady. The dough was ready to rest, so she covered it with a cloth and leaned back against the table, arms crossed. What steadied you before this place? Merrick set the draw knife aside. My father's tools. Wood doesn't lie. You cut too deep, it splits. You rush the grain, it won't hold. Teaches you patience. Brielle watched him, her expression unreadable. You ever think about starting something else? A trade in town, maybe. Or a shop? I thought about building things for folks once. Chairs, fence rails, coffins. His mouth drew tight for a moment. But I didn't want to be the man they saw only on their worst days. She crossed the room slowly, sat on the stool across from him. You could build things that last. Not everything has to be for grieving. He looked at her then, the firelight catching on the edge of his jaw. I've been thinking about that more lately. The wind shifted outside, rattling the stovepipe. Liam let out a small cry, and Brielle stood to lift him, holding him against her chest. She rocked gently, her chin resting atop his head. Merrick rose and moved to the hearth, adjusting a log with the poker. I was thinking, he said after a pause, I could start adding on out back, close in that lean-to, make a proper room. For what? She asked, her voice cautious. For you, he said, not turning. If you wanted it, if you planned to stay. She didn't answer right away. Liam's hand curled into her collar, and she kissed the top of his head without thought. Her eyes stayed on Merrick's back, on the way his shoulders held still like he was bracing for something. I don't need my own room, she said quietly. Not if we're building something together. He turned then, slowly, and met her gaze. Outside, the rain softened, turning to mist. That night, Merrick brought in the cradle from beside the hearth and set it near the bed. Brielle laid Liam down gently, smoothing the blanket over his small chest. She stood in the dim light, watching her son's breathing ease into sleep. Merrick stood behind her, quiet. When she turned, he offered his hand not as he had on that dusty trail, not out of pity or duty, but something rooted deeper. She took it. No words passed between them. They lay down side by side, the distance gone. When dawn pulled light across the floorboards, Brielle opened her eyes to find Merrick already awake, his hand resting over hers. Liam stirred softly in the cradle nearby, but did not cry. She looked at Merrick, her voice still hushed by the morning. This feels like the beginning of something I thought I'd lost the right to hope for. He kissed the back of her hand, rough lips against soft skin. You didn't lose it. It was just waiting. And when she smiled, it wasn't for him alone, it was for the life they were already shaping, quiet and strong, like the land beneath their feet. By late September, the air had shifted. The heat had softened into something quieter, the grasses along the ridge turning brittle and gold. Brielle stepped out early each morning to gather wind-fallen apples from the tree near the goat pen, the hem of her skirt damp with dew by the time she returned. Inside the cabin, Merrick had taken to boiling chicory and drying strips of venison near the fire, the scent of smoke clinging to his sleeves when he leaned close to kiss her temple. The lean-to had been framed out and enclosed now, its walls flush with the back of the cabin. Merrick had built it with his own hands, measured and cut each board, nailed each slat with careful deliberation. Brielle helped where she could, hammering shingles into place with Liam swaddled on her back, his soft weight pressing into her spine as she worked. One evening, after the boy had fallen asleep to the sound of Merrick's quiet whistling, she stepped out onto the porch and found him sitting on the edge with a worn ledger open in his lap. He was squinting at the page, charcoal pencil in hand, the firelight catching in the hollows of his cheeks. You keeping accounts? She asked, settling beside him. Trying to, he murmured. Been thinking about milling some of the pine up by the ridge. could sell finished boards down in Gallatin come spring. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. You'd have to build a sled. Get it down the slope, across the river. I know. Been drawing up the rig. She looked at the page, the careful lines and measurements, and then at him. You ever think about hiring someone on? Just for the season. He tilted his chin. Used to think I didn't need anyone else. But it's different now. She reached over, brushing a curl of sawdust from his collar. How so? He hesitated. Because now I've got something worth bringing help in for. Not just the land. You, Liam. This whole place feels like it has a future again. She didn't answer, only leaned into his side until he put his arm around her. They sat like that until the ledger slipped shut in his lap and the fire burned down to coals. The next week, Merrick rode into town and returned with 2 bolts of calico, a sack of flour, and a small cedar chest. Inside the chest was a folded length of white linen edged with lace. Brielle ran her fingers over it, her voice catching. Where'd you find this? Mrs. Canfield down in Willow Creek. She still keeps a store. Said it was made for her daughter. Girl passed before her wedding. Brielle folded the linen against her chest, her throat tight. You already planned this out? He nodded. I wasn't sure when to ask, but I've known for a while. She stepped closer, her voice soft. Then ask now. He reached for her hand. Brielle Thorne, would you marry me and stay with me, here, for all our days? She stared at him for a long moment, then smiled with tears in her eyes. Yes, I will. They were married 2 Sundays later, beneath the same apple tree she'd been harvesting from. They didn't have a preacher, just old Mr. Laren from downriver who'd once read for the circuit and still knew the words. Merrick wore his best shirt. Brielle wore the white linen and a sprig of rosemary tucked into her braid. Liam, dressed in a wool vest Merrick had stitched from scraps, sat wide-eyed in her arms through the whole service. After, they shared bread and cider with the handful of neighbors who'd come. There was no music, no dancing, just stories passed beside the fire and the quiet comfort of people who'd known hardship and still chose to gather. Later, after the guests had ridden back out and Liam slept in the cradle Merrick had built, Brielle stood by the window with her hands resting against the sill. Merrick came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Didn't think I'd ever have this, he said against her shoulder. She turned in his arms. You didn't just find it. You made it. He touched her cheek, his thumb brushing the faint scar she'd earned hauling water in Kansas winters. So did you. They lay that night with the window open, the scent of apple bark and cool earth drifting into the room. Her head rested over his heartbeat, and his hand lay over hers, their fingers woven together. The seasons turned. The garden died back, and Merrick showed her how to cure squash in the loft and hang onions from the rafters. Snow came early that year, but they were ready. Brielle quilted by the hearth while Merrick carved wooden toys for Liam's first real Christmas. He was walking by then, his steps wobbly and proud, his laughter a sound that filled even the quietest corners of the house. By spring, the sled was built. Merrick made his first lumber run in March and came back with enough coin to buy a new hand plow and a milk cow. Brielle planted rows behind the cabin, and Liam toddled after her, hands in the dirt. Their days found a rhythm again, not the survival kind she'd once known, but something richer. Merrick taught Liam to whittle. Brielle taught him to read. They built shelves, a second cradle, a smokehouse. They hosted neighbors for meals, traded preserves for cloth, and watched the stars from the porch on warm nights. Years passed. The land aged with them, generous and honest. The wind still came down from the mountains, but it no longer sounded lonely, carried the scent of home. And in that place they built together hand over hand. Mile by mile Brielle and Merrick lived the rest of their lives not in fear or in searching, but in the quiet certainty of having found what they were meant for. Together, always,